Hello everyone, welcome to our Tuesday sew along. Today we are going to be doing block 33, take a gander. But before we do that, if you regularly go to our YouTube channel and watch the videos, you might have noticed that last week's video had the right label on it, but it was the wrong video. It was actually, should have been block 20, session 22, no, 32, but it was, and it said it was 32, but it was actually the video from block 30. So evidently I grabbed the wrong video when I uploaded it. So anyway, I fixed it. If you haven't gotten a chance to watch last week's video, it is labeled correctly and it is on there. So you can watch that. So we've got several people from all over. We've got Florida already here. And so we're going to get started. So today's block is actually a huge 9-patch, I'm going to call it. And I've had some pieces of units that I've played with in the last few weeks, and I decided to talk a little bit about what we have here is a huge 9-patch. If I take out any of the sections, you can quickly see that it's a 9-patch, 3 by 3 units. I could switch several of the units to be something completely different. In fact, I could put a solid square here. We'll just stick this one here so you can see. Wouldn't matter what color you used, it would still be a 9-patch. So that would be a way to make some changes. You could also simply put a half square in the corners. And we've actually done several blocks that had different units. You could change the direction the half squares are. So what we're playing with the Blockbuster patterns are simply shapes that you can put together different units to make assorted blocks. And today we're going to be doing a block called Geese on the Edge, and we'll be talking about that in just a minute. The coloring I chose for my block has a red center. If these were plain squares, that's kind of an Ohio Star arrangement. So that is a traditional block, and it's just got some unusual pieces for the center or for the corners. So let's talk first of all about just review what you would do to make these hourglass units. So I've actually done a little bit of the sewing ahead of time just to save time. So I have my 2 squares. I've got them face to face, and I've drawn my 2 lines. I've stitched on both lines. So at this point, what I would do is cut those apart, just corner to corner, and then I'm ready to press, and we're ready to do the second step of our hourglass units. So let me move this out of the way for a minute and move this out of the way. And what we're going to do is open these up. You can press open. I tend to press to the side if I can. So that is certainly an option. By the way, while I'm finger pressing this, I do have a couple of classes coming up. One is the Morning Star class on Saturday, this Saturday. It still has some openings. The Morning Star is a wedge star tool class, and there are seats available in person as well as via Zoom. So we run those at the same time. It works very well. If the feathered star class interests you, we do have spaces available on Zoom, but in-person classes or seats are sold out. So just so you know. So at this point, I would, if I'm making half squares like these, if I wanted this on my corners, I would trim to a 4.5-inch square. I'm actually going to make hourglass units out of these. So what I'm going to do is take a couple of these. We'll just do a couple of them. And I'm going to put my squares face to face, and I want to alternate where my red square is. And I can feel with my fingertips when I have that locked in and nested. Then I'm going to need to grab a magic wand, and I'm going to draw my line corner to corner, but I want to make sure that I go across this center seam, and I'm going to draw my lines on both sides, and then I'm ready to stitch. So we'll do just a couple of these. I'm not going to take the time to do both of them, but I'm going back to the sewing area, and we've got somebody from Grand Lake watching us. Okay, so I'm ready to stitch this. I don't have to layer these face to face. I got to change to a camera where you can see what I'm doing, don't I? I don't have to layer these face to face to draw my lines. I did, but I could actually just draw my lines on half of my half square blocks, place them together, and then stitch. And of course, if I was doing this whole block again, I would assembly line sew. I would get the other one ready and sew it right after this one so that I get them all done at the same time. So once I get across, I'm going to grab my fabric tag and park my needle. So I'm going to show you a little trick. Sometimes I don't always tell you what I'm doing, but notice what color thread I'm using. I don't know if you can see it. It's pink because I was doing a little applique and I had pink thread and I had to have pink thread for my bobbin. So I filled my bobbin. I didn't completely fill it up, but I didn't use it all. So if it's a piecing that you're not planning to press open, you can use just about any color thread because you should not see the thread if you've pressed to one side or the other. Sometimes if you're pressing open, you run a risk of seeing the thread, and that might be an issue. But on this, I've got pink thread in my bobbin. I have cream colored thread in the top, but that's where my line is, so you don't see that really either. But I'm going to twizzle the center here. Just twist just a little bit so that when I finger press this, all of the seams around that center point follow each other. So this was the way I pressed originally. So now I'm going to go this way. This is the way I pressed originally, and now I'm going to go this way. Once I get that finger pressed into shape, then I'm going to grab the other one and give it just a little twist. What I'm doing is taking out the 2 or 3 stitches that are here in the seam allowance beyond the cross seam. And I'm going to do the same thing with this. I want all the seams to follow each other. And when they do, then I can set the iron on it. It wasn't playing nice. So now this is when I'm going to just grab the acorn pressing solution, give it a little swipe, and set the iron on it. While that's heating, I'm going to grab the acorn pressing solution and press the other direction. So once you get that done, you're ready to trim. So since this is a 9 patch that will finish at 12 inches, each one of my units need to finish at 4. So all I have to do is trim this to 4.5. So if you're right-handed, you're going to put the half circle icon on the top right corner of your unit. Also, if you're left-handed, you just put that on the top left corner. I'm also looking for, let me move this unit out of the way. I'm looking for the line that says 4.5. That line's going on one seam. The bold solid line's going on the opposite seam. And where it forms an X, I know that belongs right on the center of my unit. And that's how I get the precision that I'm after. So I'm going to go up and across. And then I'm going to turn 180 degrees and I'm going to put the 4.5-inch line on the cross seam again. This dashed line, that's my 4.5-inch square marking. That's going to end up on the edges, my cut edges, so that I have a 4.5-inch square that will finish at 4 inches. And notice I did not cut a lot off, just enough to give me the precision. So I'm just going to do the same thing. I would do this 4 times and I would just tweak it until I get those lines lined up with the cross seams Go up and across and turn 180 degrees. I'm still putting that half circle icon on the top right corner of my half or hourglass square. Cut up and across, and there's half of the units I need for my block. So there's two of them. And I could even change the orientation of that as well. If I did that, then I would sure want a different color in the center, but notice how different that would look. So you have options for how you're going to put together your unit. So let me, oh, I need to leave that there, and I'm going to move these out of our way for right now. So this is where I'm headed with that. We're going to be looking at this geese on the edge unit here in just a second, but I want to show you just as a review. For those of you who haven't watched before, I have some charts that I occasionally show. This is the, let me find the right chart. There's my Tucker Trimmer chart. I need to put it on top. There it is. So I was doing the hourglass unit. In the chart, it shows you that you're going to take two squares. If you're doing half square units, you would line up two squares face to face, and then you would draw your two lines. And when you get through stitching and cutting and pressing, you end up with two half squares ready to trim. If you're doing hourglass units, you simply take those two half squares and layer them, and then you're going to skip the center line completely. That is what you would do if you're making combination units. We are not making combination units, so that's why we actually skip that second line. But on the side, on the left side of this chart, it explains that if you need half squares, you're going to add 1 inch to the finished size you want, and that's the starter square. If you're making hourglass units or even combo units for that matter, you're going to add 1.5 inches for your starter squares. So what we're going to do now is look at the geese on the edge technique. Now, it is a technique sheet. We do have that available here at the shop. So if you don't own it, you want to order it, you can find it on our website. And it is a technique that on the top corner, it'll tell you you need the wing clipper and the Tucker trimmer. It also has a 3-star rating. That means that's the level of difficulty indicator. Don't let that scare you because the instructions are very good. You can sit down with your technique sheet, watch the video that explains the process, but I'm going to walk you through the process of doing the unit, the geese on the edge unit that you see here. So now, first of all, we're going to start with a square that's cut to the precise size we're after. We're going to add some strips of cream. Then we're going to, and those will be oversized. Then we're going to add an oversized triangle. Then we'll trim that part of the unit up. Then we're going to add 2 more oversized strips and another oversized triangle, and we trim up the whole thing. So we're going to do some assembly line sewing for this. So I've already stitched the first section on, and what I did, I have a strip that's an oversized measurement, and my squares cut to the size I really want to finish with. Once I get through stitching them, and I stitched one after the other, and I leave a space. That's very important. This is all in the instructions of the technique sheet. The next thing I'm going to do is grab something I can cut against, and I've got a horizontal line here that I'm lining up on the seam, and I'm going to cut right even with the right size of the side of the square. And notice I've got my fabric facing up, and I've pressed toward the strip. And I'm just going to scoot over, line up a horizontal line somewhere on my ruler with that seam, and cut even with that square. The square is cut to the size I need, so I'm really not trimming that at all. I'm scooting my ruler over where it's right at the edge of that square. And now I've got my 4 units ready to take to the sewing area. So let's show you what you're going to do next. I've got my plate over here with all of my pieces. Kyle says she's always wondered what to do with those extra bobbins. See, if you might as well use them. I have to tell you though, I'll tell a story of my sister and I. My mother was a seamstress. She was not a quilter, but she made dresses, clothes, wedding gowns, all of that kind of stuff. And she taught my sister and I to sew. So there was always this competition because why we didn't buy some extra bobbins, I don't know. But we had only seemed like a small amount of bobbins. So my sister and I would be sewing and we'd need a bobbin. So we took turns covering each other's thread up, which I don't recommend. I use one bobbin with one color thread. If I need another bobbin, I get another empty bobbin. But I got in trouble a lot of times for covering up her bobbin thread. And when you're making clothing, it is a little more important to have the exact match color. I actually stitch almost everything with cream or gray. This one's kind of a beige that I'm using. And unless you're sewing with bright white or black, it's not so important that your thread match. If you're sewing with a lot of bright white, then you probably want to use a light colored thread. But right now I have pink in the bobbin. So I am using the side that I cut against. This is the way it was laying on the cutting area. Let me back out a little bit so you can see. That's the way it was laying on the cutting area, and I was cutting right up against the edge of the side of the square that's cut to size. Then when I place it on my long strip, I want to leave a space between the one that I just stitched on. I don't know if you can see the space, but I'm leaving, a 1/4 inch or so. And this little piece of cream that I sewed on the first time goes on the top through the machine first so that the square feeds through last. And you just keep adding them each time, leaving a little space in between. Now, a couple of reasons that you want to sew with the square on top. The square, remember, is cut to size. So I want to watch the edge of my square as I'm stitching those pieces on because the square really doesn't get trimmed. A lot of times when we're putting things together to use Tucker tools to trim them, we don't have to be fussy with it because we know we're going to trim it. This square is already the size that it needs to be for making our unit. So we're not going to trim that down. So we want to make sure that we're sewing with an accurate 1/4 inch seam. Once you get to the end of the however many you're doing, and I'm making 4, then you can cut your thread. So we're going to cut here. And I left a little bit of space just for wiggle room here. And we're ready to take this to the sewing or the pressing area and press it. Let me grab my fabric tag because I want to part my needle. And we're ready to go trim this apart. So my first step is to press this. And I want to press toward the strip every time. So I'm just going to finger press it. And let me turn this sideways so I can lay this whole strip on my pressing area because it's going to be easier to press everything if I can finger press the whole strip and have it laying flat before I set the iron to any part of it. So notice you can see where I've left a space in between each one of my pieces, which is the way I want that to work. So I'm just going to give it a quick little press. If you're using the acorn pressing pin, this would be a good time to just give it a swipe. And on this gold thread, it actually shows up, but a lot of times it does not show up. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. I didn't put it on the first time, I don't think. I don't really remember because I did that earlier. And I'm ready to cut these apart. So again, I want to place this on my cutting area. Move this out of the way. If you've got room on your cutting area to lay out the whole strip in one, okay, I'm not sure why it's all of a sudden decided not to be in focus. Let me see if I can get it to read. Sometimes if you can get it to read something else, it'll, goodness gracious. Okay, we'll try it this way. We're going to come down and see if it'll focus on it, and then I can back it back out. There we go. Isn't that crazy? Let's see if it stayed in focus. Pretty well. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is cut at the edge of the square. And remember, that part does not get trimmed in particular. So I'm actually just cutting right to the edge of the square. I'm putting a horizontal line right on that seam so I know that I'm cutting across my strip straight. And I'm just going to keep going, matching up on the right side of my square and matching up a horizontal line with that seam. And I've got my 4 units. Now I'm ready to do the next step. So at this point, this is when I need my wing clipper tool. And I'm going to be using this wing clipper tool in an unusual way. If I'm making flying geese, let me grab one just so I can lay this here so you can see how it's different. If I am making flying geese and I need to trim, I would lay the goose first pointing toward me, and then the lines on the ruler, this long diagonal line would always go on the right seam, and the line according to the size I'm making would go on the left seam. So this one's actually already been trimmed, but that's basically how you would place the tool in order to get the perfect seam allowance here. And then you would turn and trim the other side. When you're doing this particular unit, you're going to turn the ruler around and you're going to use the back end, the bottom edge of the ruler. So when you see this little tiny triangle at the bottom of that long diagonal, that is going on the edge of my square. And I want to make sure that whole small triangle here is on the edges of the strip, not on my square, because that's what's going to reserve my seam allowance so that when I trim this off, I'm left with the seam allowance I need for the next seam that's going across. So I'm going to do that with all 4 units. You want to make sure that tiny triangle is on your strips and your lines. It just happens to be the lines at the far corners of your wing clipper tool. Those lines are going to line up with the seams that I put the strips on. You're going to do that with all 4 of them. There's my tiny triangle. There's my lines on the seams. And I'm going to cut that excess off. Now, if you like to make, I think they call them crumb quilts or mini quilts or any number of things, you could save that piece and use it for something. I'm just going to move it out of my way for now. You are not going to need it for the process of what we're going to do. So your next step is to grab some squares. Your instructions tell you what size these squares need to be. So for my 4 units here, I need 2 squares that are oversized, and I'm going to actually cut corner to corner so that I have 4 triangles. And it just so happens I'm going to do that twice, because here's what my unit will look like. If you want to, these don't have to be the same color. You could choose one color for the first triangle, a different color for the second triangle, and you can create all sorts of interesting looks that way. And believe it or not, these 2 triangles finish at the same size. Right now, it looks like this outer triangle is much bigger than the inner triangle, but remember, this one already has a seam that has been taken out of this triangle. So they actually end up being the same size. So I actually just need to have the other 2 triangles ready. So I'm going to take my 2 oversized squares, cut it in half. So I've got 4 triangles that will be the outer triangle of my goose on the edge. So we're going to take all of this to the sewing area, and I'll show you what we're going to do next. So if you have questions, be sure and post them, because Tony's monitoring if you have questions or comments about what you're seeing. So here's what we're going to do. Nope. Try this one. All right. So I have a triangle here, and I'm going to grab one, and I'm going to place it. And I like to put the triangle on bottom because I'm looking for that intersection where those two seams crisscross. That's where my stitching line needs to be in order to make that perfect point on the corner of my square. And I'm also leaving just a little bit of an ear on both sides of my triangle. This triangle is going to be trimmed when I trim that outer edge, so I don't have to worry too much about it. I just want to even it up where they are basically equal, and I'm going to be aiming for that intersection where those two seams crisscross. You get down a little tighter so you can see it. That's the intersection I'm looking for. And if you need to pin it in order to be able to keep it under control, that's perfectly fine. I tend not to pin it, but you could. So again, I'm going to place that so that I can put the square on top. Because remember, anytime you have a part of your unit that does not get trimmed, you want to put that on top. So I've got a little bit of an ear sticking out there. I'm going to stitch, and I'm headed for that intersection. You can pin it if you need to. I'm basically just holding it in place. Some people use a stiletto when they stitch. I never have. If I have something that I need to keep control of, I actually always have one of these close by. So you could use that for a stiletto. Just keep in mind you don't want this underneath your needle because that could knock your machine out of time and cause all sorts of problems. So I've got 4 of these triangles that I'm adding to this first part of my unit. And I'm going to line that up, stitch it through. The instructions on the technique sheet are going to give you sizing information for several different options of geese on the edge. On this particular block, all of the geese on the edge units, these strips are the same size, but there are options so that you can make a thin one, a thick one, 2 thin ones, a thick one, and alternate. You have all sorts of options other than what I'm showing you. So that is one reason why you're going to want to get that technique sheet. That's my intersection I'm after. When I get to that intersection, I'm going to grab my fabric tag and park my needle, and then I'm ready to take this to my ironing surface. So Cheryl Ann is here from St. Peters, Missouri. We have all kinds of different locations that people join us from, and we're happy about that. Okay, so I am ready to do the next step, and I'm going to press toward the triangle this time. I always finger press, even if I'm doing 1,000 of these. If you came to the shop and watched me do them, you're going to see me finger press first. That gets the seam going the direction I want it to without any little tucks in my piece that I wasn't aware of, and then set the iron on it. Oh, Tony says I'm too low. Oh, this is where I had the thing. It's just being contrary today. So I've got my 4 units. It's also crooked, I realize that, but there we go. And now you're going to grab your acorn pressing pin, give it a swipe down that triangle seam. You can kind of see the solution appear on some of these blue. And often I will stack them like this so that they all are going to get a little bit of heat that way. So that makes them nice and flat. So this is a two-step trimming process. And in that particular respect, I'm going to grab my Tucker trimmer. It went fuzzy again. It must not like the Tucker trimmer. I'm not sure what that is. On this, you're going to trim during the process of making these. And the first time you're going to trim, it'll tell you that you're going to trim for, I'm looking on my sheet so I don't tell you the wrong number. So we're going to position the 3.5-inch square for the size we're making. The 3.5-inch line is going on the edge of our square. Once I get that in place, that also makes the cross seam here line up on that corner, because this needs to be a 3.5-inch square at this point. I'm going to trim just two sides, up and over, and I'm not going to turn it around and trim this tail off. I'm not worried about that yet. I'm going to do that with all 4 units. Put the 3.5-inch line on the edge of your square. Make sure that your cross diagonal seam goes right in the corner of that square. And you're going to do that with all 4 pieces. 3.5-inch line. And your instructions on your sheet are going to explain what you line up so that what you know what you're supposed to be cutting. And there's my 4th one. Once you get that done, you're ready to stitch some more strips, your square units onto strips again. So when you get ready to do this the next time, we're coming back to the needle. So here's my strip, and this is the strip that I was sewing on a minute ago. And I sewed my 4 units on there, and then I just trimmed away. So don't get rid of this. I'm still using the same color strip. So I'm just ready to add this back. And I want to stitch with that little tail. The triangle part goes on the bottom. And I'm going to stitch up, across, and I'm just using the edge of my presser foot as my guide. Thinking, hang on a second, I want to make sure I don't put the wrong side on there. It's still going to work, but we'll see. Nope, I'm right. So I'm just stitching right along the edge. I've got the triangle at the bottom edge of my area here. We're going to line that up. And I'm also leaving a little space. Even though I've got that little tail there, I'm not too worried about it. I'm just going to stitch right on down the edge. And I'm leaving a little space in between each of these units. It gives me plenty of room right along the edge of my presser foot. The triangle has already been trimmed to size. Once you get past your 4th piece, then you're ready to cut your thread. We're going to park our needle. And again, I've got more than I need here, so I'm just going to cut off a little chunk of it. And notice I have just left a little bit there, and I still have this much of my strip left. I'm going to save it because I can use that on the next step. So I'm ready to press this. If you've got room to turn your pressing area so that you can press this way, you'll be happier. And you want to press toward the strip that you just added every time. Question, Tony says. Yes, usually. My preferred method would be before I cut anything, if I'm doing fat quarters or yardage or whatever I'm doing, I typically press with Best Press or a spritzer of the Acorn Pressing Mister or Magic Sizing or Starch. If I had all of them here and was going to grab one of them, I probably grab Best Press just because it's always handy and it's just a push button, or it's not an aerosol, I guess is the best way to say that. And so that is generally what I do. Your fabric will cut better, stitch better if it's got just a little bit of starch or a starch type product on it. So I'm ready to cut these apart. And again, I've got it laying here with the strip that I added on the bottom. I'm going to find a horizontal line on my ruler and line it up on the seam. And I want to cut right to the edge of that. That is cut to size. So I really don't want to trim anything off of here. Sometimes I get a thread. I don't know if you can see it, but there was a tiny thread that came off of the blue triangle, which is okay. You just don't want to be cutting a lot off of that. And once you get this cut, I've got almost this little stair step area here, which is okay. That's going to get trimmed off. Again, I'm lining up on the seam and cutting up just right to the edge of that triangle. And I go all the way across doing that. Once you get that done, you're ready to stitch the next strip on. So we're going to go back to the sewing area. And Cheryl Ann said that it is not, she said, totally off the subject. It's really not totally off the subject because anything you can do to help your piecing and make your sewing more enjoyable, everybody wants to know those things. Okay, so here's my unit. I'm looking at the back side of it. I'm going to put that strip that I added last at the top. The square is going to be at the bottom, and you can easily tell I want to add to the edge that's straight. This edge is not straight. I don't have any of my triangle there, so I want to make sure that this is the edge I'm stitching on, and I'm going to line this up. This is that piece of a strip that I just trimmed off, and I'm using my presser foot as my guide to stitch along the edge of that. We're going to line that up, and I just make sure that none of my seams flip when I get to them. And like I said, if you feel the need to pin, you could certainly do that. Okay, so I have enough room on this little bit of a strip to put another one. And that's just kind of how I determine whether to use that part or not. If there's enough room to put it on there, I use it because that's the most efficient use of your fabric. And I'm lining that up. My strip that I added last goes at the top so that I'm stitching along the side of the triangle. Now I'm just going to stitch off of that because I don't have enough room left to add any more of that. But here's the next strip. And I don't want to use the selvage edge. So I'm just going to stitch onto that so that when I add this next one, I am not including any selvage in what I'm stitching on. Because I've got about a 1/2 inch of my strip before I added this part that has my piecing unit on there. And then my last one, I'm going to line that up. Now at this point, for the size I'm making, I am through adding strips. But you're going to see on your technique sheet, you could add 4 strips, 5 strips. You could add any number of strips and just keep adding them, and you would do the next step in the same manner. So this happens to have 2 of my piecing units on this little piece of the strip and 2 more on this piece. So let's grab that fabric tag and park the needle and go back to the overhead camera so you can see what we do next. So your first step is to press, and you want to press toward the strip you just added. And then we're going to set the iron on that. Let it heat up a little bit. This is the part right here that has a little bit of selvage in it. You don't want to use the selvage in your piecing. It's not woven the same and it just doesn't play nice. So you want to avoid using that in your project. But I know I'm going to cut that part off anyway, so I didn't worry about cutting it off ahead of time. So there's two of them. Grab the other two. You're going to press toward the strip. Give it a little finger press. There's a little bit more selvage there, but that part's going to get trimmed off, so I'm not worried about it. You just don't want to use it in your project. Set the iron on there. Let the iron do the work and get your acorn pressing pin. Give it a little swipe with that. I didn't get any right there. So I am ready to cut these apart and add the final triangle. So, another question. I keep my iron on scorch. Well, I tell you, I kind of joke and say I leave it on scorch. Okay, I'll talk about that in just a second. I'm lining a horizontal line up on the seam and I'm cutting right to the edge of my square. This is basically trimmed to size. This is going to get trimmed off at the end, but you just want to line that up. Now here is the selvage part that I said it's going to get trimmed off. I'm not going to use that part anyway, but that selvage is a problem for my project because it didn't end up in my unit. Okay, so somebody asked what setting I keep my iron on. Unless you have an old iron that's got some places on it that are scorched and you need to clean the pad of your iron, this iron has a little bit of places in here. It looks like I need to clean it. And I'll ask Tony to write me a note. We'll talk about how you clean your iron next week. I'm not going to take the time to do it today. But if your iron face, I'm not going to touch this one because guess what? It's hot. There's a little place right there that I need to clean this too. If you see places like that on your iron, you're much more likely to end up with a scorch mark or a smudge on your project. So you want to keep the face plate of your iron clean. So you want to make sure that you do get that part cleaned off. That being said, you actually can leave your iron on there longer than you think without it scorching. Now, I wouldn't walk off and leave it or anything, but in the space of time it takes me to talk about what I'm doing, I've never had a problem. If you've ever watched Karen K. Buckley on some of her videos, I'm sitting there watching her saying, pick it up, because she leaves it on there a really long time. And she evidently doesn't have any trouble either. So I've always subscribed to if they can do it, how hard can it be? So I figure I can leave it on there and it won't be a problem. So I see another question. Many of you know, Amy says, I haven't been on in a while. How's Carly? Carly is our daughter. She is in Estonia for a year of Fulbright Fellowship, and she's an English teaching assistant. And she's really good, except they had a water problem, and in fixing it, the water in the island where she lives is contaminated. So she's had a bout of illness that is just almost over. So she's excited that it's almost over, but it's been an experience for her. I'm sure she doesn't want to repeat. So I'm going to go back to the overhead camera because I forgot a step. Because I need to trim off this corner like I did before. I'm going to be using the back end of the wing clipper, and I'm going to line it up on my seams and make that little triangle line up on the strip so that I am reserving the seam allowance for my next seam. And I'm going to do that on all 4 units. So Carly comes home on July 4th, and I think she'll be ready to come home for a while. She has enjoyed it and learned a lot and has gained a lot of good experience from her year in Estonia, but she's ready to come back to the States for a while. Okay, so I've got my 4 pieces done, and I had those 4 triangles that I cut from the oversized squares. And so that's where we're going. We're going to put the unit on top, the triangle on bottom, so that when we stitch through, we can see that intersection where the 2 seams intersect, cross. And I'm going to just kind of center it on there so I have just a little bit of an ear sticking out on both sides. And that's where I'm headed. I'm aiming for that intersection right there. So that's where we're going. We're going to stitch right along the edge of my 1/4 inch patchwork foot. Um, Tony, we need to write a note, 2 notes. One, talk about how to clean your iron. And the other one, I'm going to show you how to check your 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we're going to grab the next one, some tricks for an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because I was going to show that, but I don't want to take the time to do that today. We're too busy sewing. So we're just going to stitch right on across that intersection is where we're headed. So they were, back to Carly, they were under a boil order. And so I said, get some bottled water. Well, she's sick in her apartment. So one of the teachers sent his class on a field trip to bring her bottled water. So she has a picture of 4 of the students on her apartment doorstep dropping off a 5-liter jug of water. So actually, they brought her 2 jugs. And in 2 days, she's about finished off both of them. Okay, so we've got one more. We're putting the triangle on bottom, our pieced unit on top, so we can see that intersection where we want to cross over. And I'm going to line up right here for that intersection. And once you get that done, you've got all of the piecing done for the size of unit we're making. But remember, you have options to add more and more strips. You could add 4 or 5 rounds of strips for this geese on the edge. And what makes it look like the goose is the triangles that you're adding on the corner. So when you get that done, you're ready to press. You don't need your wing clipper anymore. You need your tucker trimmer. So we're just going to lay that aside. And the first thing we're going to do is press toward the triangle. Give it a finger press. And typically, I'll start out by finger pressing, set the iron on it, finger pressing, and just overlap them. That way they get a little extra time under the iron. Once you do that, then you're ready to grab the acorn pressing solution if you're going to use that. And we've got all 4 of them ready to trim. So what you're going to need is a 4.5-inch unit in order to fit in our 12-inch block. When you're looking at this, this side is basically straight and to size. This side is straight. You need to trim off those 2 edges. You're going to need to trim off this edge, and you're going to need to trim off this edge. I find it easiest to line up this corner with my 4.5-inch line. That's the size I know I need. So I line up the 4.5-inch line right here, the 4.5-inch square, I guess I should say, on the edges of my square. That puts the diagonal line right through the points of my triangle so that I can trim up and across. And that automatically gives me this side exactly what I need. Then I'm going to turn this. Even though this doesn't need to be trimmed to make the size I need, I can give that just a little haircut just in case. And sometimes there's a thread or 2 that get trimmed. So that gets rid of those 2 little edges. That gets rid of any threads that are just kind of wonky on the side. But if you'll put the triangles that you added, your geese on the edge, on the top right corner if you're right-handed, top left corner if you're left-handed, and cut that side first, you'll be more successful. So I've got the diagonal line right through the points of my square and my first triangle. Line up the 4.5-inch lines on the square, and I'm going to turn, and the 4.5-inch line now goes on my cut edges. Also, I didn't really talk a lot about this. My diagonal line is going to go through the points of my triangle again, but I also have a diagonal line that should be parallel to my triangles. It may or may not line up exactly on the triangle. I don't worry too much if it doesn't, but it's just right on the edge. And see, that one got a little bit more of a haircut. That's okay, because it's going to be a 4.5-inch square, and it's going to line up the way I want to. So I want to put the 4.5-inch line on my corner square, line up that diagonal line through the point of my square and the point of my triangle, cut up and across, and line up here on the bottom edge. And that time there was nothing, oh, there was a thread off of that one strip. So this gives me the exact size unit I need, a 4.5-inch square. This one's got a little bit of wonkiness, so we're going to fix that. Let me show you how I fixed that. The way that I knew that there was a little bit of wonkiness, when I put the 4.5-inch line on my square, there's just a little bit here that it's kind of shifted off to the side, and I want to fix that. So I'm just going to kind of push the fabric. I don't tug and manipulate my fabric a lot, but in this case, I need to pull this strip back a little bit, and I'm just going to give it a little heat while I do it. And you're going to be amazed at how much that straightens up that edge. It may not be exact, but it's going to be a whole lot better. So see what happened? Now it's exactly on my line, which is what I want. You can do a little bit of shifting of units that aren't exactly the way you want them, but you want to be cautious about shifting and tugging and pulling and stretching on your fabric. But that worked out really well to straighten up that edge where it didn't quite meet. Now I have 4 of my geese on the edge units. So that's where I'm headed with my geese on the edge. So that being said, remember, you don't have to arrange your units in the same manner that you see mine arranged. I could take these geese on the edge and turn them all with the square on the inside. It looks different, but very similar. So it's a way of doing that. And I actually prepared ahead of time a sample that you could, I did it with the electric quilt program so that you could see an alternate way of setting it. So the one on the left, I have to think about this. The one on the left was the first way with the square in the corner, and it has a tiny red sashing corner square in between those 4 gold squares. So that was the first way that you saw it laying. The one on the right is the one I just turned it with the square toward the inside of the block. And notice it looks like it creates a secondary pattern of that little geese on the edge, and it has an extra little block in there. So if you wanted to do the Ohio star in the middle, leave out the gold square, you could even put it in a different color, and then it creates a secondary block, and it makes it an interesting way of arranging your units. It's always fun to see a block or a quilt where the blocks are in an unexpected place and secondary patterns are created. So it makes it a kind of an interesting block. So you can play with the arrangement of your geese on the edge units. There are some really fun little patterns that only include geese on the edge. So You can make all sorts of interesting little patterns with that particular technique. So if you don't own the Geese on the Edge technique sheet, contact us and we'll get it to you, or we'll save you one and we'll get you going on Geese on the Edge. Katha says she likes the second one. So if I was doing a whole quilt with this block, I would probably arrange it like this one so that it created that little pattern, secondary pattern with these triangles on the corners and a little corner square of sashing of some nature in the center. So I could even take just these units. I mean, I encourage you, this is my basket of leftover units of things I've demonstrated with. Grab some of these other shapes and play with arranging your pieces in different ways. So I could take my Geese on the Edge. I was going to show you what it would create. Oh, well, what I'm going to show you now, it won't matter. I was just wanting to show you how it would look if you put something else in the center and just use the Geese on the Edge units to create an interesting little arrangement of blocks. So see, that's what you get when you put those in the center. You could also make a pinwheel. I have to think about how I'd want to do this. It would go this way. You've got lots of options for how you put that together. Nope, this way. So it creates a little circle. If you did this, then it ends up with that in the center. But that could be an interesting arrangement too. So you have lots of options for how you put this together. It's always fun to play with the units, and you don't have to do, I can't remember who it was, some trunk show that I saw. They said a pattern is just a suggestion. You don't have to do it exactly like they did it. So we get lots of fun, interesting combinations of things when we branch out and try new arrangements. So until next week, we'll see you live at 5 next Tuesday. But until then, come see us and happy sewing.